my entire screen. Okay. Share. And lecture. Nope, sorry, not this one, this one. Yep. So, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, today we're talking about urban actors, their coalitions, and strategies in order to understand how urban development functions on meso level, not on macro level, as we talked before, but on this middle level of social processes. And we will touch upon two articles today. The first one is by David Harvey. It has as yeah, so it's the second Harvey's article we're gonna read in this course, and it has a very difficult name title to pronounce, from managerialism to entrepreneurialism. I will later explain what are those words. And the second theory we will talk about is a theory by researcher named Harvey Moloch. So in case of David Harvey, Harvey is a surname. In case of Harvey Moloch, Harvey is a name. Don't ask me why. I don't know how it can be, but English names can be this way as well. But actually, Moloch has some, I think, Slavic roots, because Moloch, it sounds super Slavic. Anyway, don't mix them. But just, sorry, I hope there is no one in this world whose name is Harvey. But imagine like David Harvey had the son and named him Harvey. Okay, it just to the main thing, do not mix the two. There is David Harvey and there is Harvey Moloch. So Harvey Moloch, and it's a coincidence that I put them together. They both wrote. It's not to start joking in the middle of the lecture. It's just to, because they wrote about very similar things at the same time, but from quite different perspectives. So Harvey Moloch develops this theory, which is called urban growth machine, or urban growth coalition, where he explains, where he's very critical towards this macro level and understanding of how cities work, and he offers us to look at the actors and their strategies, how in the way they develop the land, or like urban space. And then we're going to talk about Ukrainian context and about neoliberal politics and how are they connected to space. So yeah, I already told you who is this guy. By this time, you need to know that it's David Harvey. But yeah, I sometimes in the lectures show his picture and ask, who is he? And yeah, the second question is, which historical events which very much affected Western world and global economy happened in 1973. Let's a bit think about the world history. What kind of events happened in this year? Please write in the chat. It's 2 words, maybe even 1. Oops, sorry, not Netflix. I'm sorry. Yep, I need to. So, 1973. You all had courses of global history, world history in school, please. Oh, no, I just closed the presentation. What's going on? No one. Do you still hear me? Okay, let's Google. Please. Like you had time to Google, just like oil crisis. That's the first thing which pops up when you Google it. So it's not the only thing which happened in 1973, but this is sort of like a very known event which shaped the whole world because of some political issues and also economical issues with Saudi Arabia. Basically, the whole global economy was uh, low on oil, and of course, if the whole it's still like this, like our system depends on oil. And now, okay, there are some alternative energy sources, but at that time it was not the case. So this whole conflict with Saudi Arabia, which was providing oil for many countries in the world, brings the whole global economy into sort of collapse. And why I'm talking about this? Because if you remember David Harvey, he wrote a lot about crises in his theory about circuits of capital. And that's the crisis he starts from. And of course, due to this crisis, it was not only economical, like issues which shake the whole world. The countries needed to somehow deal with this crisis. And what was done is that these systems of social welfare state, which at that time were quite well developed in Western Europe, social welfare state. Who could explain me what is it? So this social welfare state, after this crisis, they started shrinking and falling apart. But first, tell me what is social welfare state? Or at least how do you translate it in Ukrainian? Yeah, so the translation in Ukrainian of social welfare state is Держава загального благополуччя. It's a quite a weird. I mean, it's a completely new term, but the idea is that after the Second World War, Western countries try to sort of. I mean, Western European. It's very important. We're talking about Western Europe. Western European countries sort of try to combine the capitalism with socialism, which existed at that time as two big forces globally. And what was done is that these type of states were developed which provide people with free education, healthcare, social housing, etc., etc. So it's a state with a strong redistribution mechanisms where the richest people, they are highly taxed, and then on these taxes you provide the whole social welfare. Like social welfare is translated as соціальна, but it's not соціальна допомога, it's like соціальна сфера. What is interesting is that Ukraine formally is still a social welfare state. Like our constitution states that we are a social welfare state, like соціальна держава. But of course, it's not in the place at all. So, and this in 1973, it's actually the year when this shift from social welfare state to more market-oriented systems started. And this strategy was called, how was it called, or is it called? When we start spending less money on education, on healthcare, on housing. Margaret Thatcher was the queen of this process together with Reagan in the US. Yes, it's neoliberalism. Yeah. Word neoliberalism first emerged as a policy towards working with this crisis of 1973. It started, as many other things we learn, it started in the UK, and Margaret Thatcher was, apart from being like a strong woman, which is very much celebrated in feminist circles, what is often forgotten, that she actually was very harsh on social welfare, which affected a lot of men and women not only in the UK but around the world. And the idea, so neoliberalism did not emerge just to, I don't know, save money for the rich, as it often portrayed it. It emerged in certain historical conditions of crisis, and that's what Harvey highlights. That we cannot just criticize, Margaret Thatcher for neoliberalism, because also, okay, she pronounced the word. I mean, she was one of the first to pronounce it, like on a in the public very loudly. But then Harvey highlights us in, I mean, this idea you can see in all of his articles, that this neoliberal agenda, it emerged as an answer to the global crisis, to the global oil crisis. Why I'm still talking about macro processes? Maybe because that's the way I'm used to think about the cities, unfortunately. But yeah, we will soon start talking about actors. But it's also why I'm talking about these macro processes, because it's important to understand the context in which things happened. So, and yeah, to answer the question more structurally, what is neoliberalism? It's a policy of introduction of commercial mechanisms to traditionally social spheres, education, science, medical sphere, etc. Yeah, and it starts in 70s after 73 oil crisis, 73rd, whatever, 73 oil crisis. But okay, in 73, we still, I mean, Soviet space could not be affected by neoliberalism as a policy because it was still planned economy. So there was no social welfare state which you could cut. Also, to highlight, there is a big difference between a Soviet system and social welfare state, because social welfare state functions as a capitalist society where you have profit, where you have big companies which earn capital, which accumulate capital, and then the state comes in and takes part of this capital and redistributes. In Soviet system, the state itself plays the role of the institution which takes care of the whole economy. Some so-called socialist state as China, they became sort of state capitalist countries where the state and the capitalist is like one institution. Soviet Union was way more complicated because market mechanisms in Soviet Union did not really exist. They existed only in the international trade. So Soviet Union was also strongly affected by this crisis because Soviet Union was trading the goods it took from people like our families globally. So, of course, when the whole global economy is in crisis, Soviet Union could not trade that much and earn that much resources. But still, we cannot say that there was something like neoliberal policy in Soviet Union, because there was it was a completely different system. Let's put it like this, not to go in deep, because I can talk about Soviet Union for hours and hours, and it's gonna become quite ugly, actually. But in post-socialist spaces, the neoliberal policies, they actually started in 90s, and they started like as everything else, like super fast. Because what happens is that the new constitutions which um, the free states started to adopt in it's the same in Russia, in Ukraine, in Belarus, even in Kazakhstan, and in Uzbekistan and other countries, other post-Soviet countries. The first constitution, they were guaranteeing a lot of basic human rights, including housing, including like as we mentioned, education and healthcare. But at the same time, these countries started from a really low stage, so they were supposed to build a social welfare state out of nothing according to their constitutions. And this thing just did not happen. I mean, it happened in some places, and it's another big topic of how the social welfare states started functioning, but dysfunctioning in post-Soviet countries. But what we had in Ukraine, that formally we used to be in 90s and still are a social welfare state. Practically, we are providing like the basic minimum of like uh, you're not like your kids will still go to school and they will learn how to read and write. um, then you and so I'm talking about what state really takes care of in terms of education. School education, university education immediately became something which requires certain level of privilege. If we're talking about 90s, you needed to have privilege in form of social capital. So you needed to know someone to get your kid into a good university. Now it's getting more and more commercialized. But what is interesting thing that in Ukrainian context, neoliberal agenda of so this commercial mechanisms of traditionally social spheres often took form of corruption. I'm going to develop on this idea because it's very important to understand. So let's talk about medical sphere. If we're talking about Western European neoliberalism, for example, you used to have a hospital, a clinic in your neighborhood. Maybe not neighborhood, but there is an clinic in your city, and majority of the services, they were free, or you were getting them for free through your state funded insurance. So like the insurance system where the state covers the insurance, and you were receiving in social welfare state, you were receiving your services just through paying taxes. Then some of these services, they become commercialized. So now maybe you pay less taxes, but probably not, because we're talking like in social welfare state, the richest were taxed. We're not talking about taxation. I mean, but it really depends on the context. Now you need to pay for these medical services yourself. In Ukrainian conditions, formally, no one requires you to pay for those services. It's still for free, but you know really well how it. I mean, now actually you're often required, like There, like you go to the hospital and there is like a price list. And of course, I'm not talking about polyclinic which is in your neighborhood. There's still, I mean, at least if we're talking about big cities, unfortunately, I mean, fortunately, I did not have experience of visiting a doctor in a village. But if we're talking about big cities, the first level of medical care is usually for free and it functions more or less okay. But then if you need to do a surgery, you're required to pay for this. And like legally, it's forbidden. But as the state does not like, and it's called corruption, and it is supposed to be punished. But as the state does not invest enough in medical sphere, such commercial mechanism as corruption emerges. So basically, behind the Western European and post-Soviet neoliberalism, there is the same logic of state decreasing the funds, decreasing taxes, first of all, and then spending less money on medical sphere. But the form it takes is very different, because in Western Europe, usually it starts from the legal mechanism of when the state comes and says, okay, now there is a new law, you're going to pay for your Medicare. We're going to reform the NHS and so on. In our case, the legal part does not really change. We still are supposed to have like free everything. But as the state defunds the Medicare, we're developing, I mean, we as actors of these processes who do not have power, we develop this informal mechanism of paying the doctors their salaries. Of course, it comes with a lot of issues, because, okay, you paid to the hospital, but there is no clear mechanism of how this money is distributed between the doctor, between the medical, other medical personnel. And in the end, what we have is that doctors which perform surgeries, they're considered to be like middle class in, I mean, depends, some of them. And I forgot the word, but it's nurses, sorry. Nurses, their salary is 3.5 thousand hryvnia, which is, yeah, you know, and they're neither getting the bribe money from bribes nor the state funding. But why? Okay, now we're in the medical sphere, somewhere far away from the cities. I was telling this whole short history of neoliberalism and in West and East, just to jump to a very simple idea which Harvey writes about in his article, that the neoliberal transformation performs in space through what he calls the change from managerialism to entrepreneurialism. And to put it simple, he says that when the state was providing enough money to develop the urban infrastructure, there was an approach which in his terms could be called like management, so managerialism. The core of the word is a manager. So there was managers which were managing the city, organizing it, looking at it as a structured system. And this approach, at the same time, I mean, Harvey sort of criticizes that we do not have this approach anymore, but at the same time, this approach was quite top-down, because you have the experts who sit there and they draw the map of the city and they manage this map as a whole. But what he says that since 70s, so with this global shift to neoliberal development of the city, the approach of development is entrepreneurialism. I'm so sorry, and the core of this word is entrepreneur. You all know the meaning, and he explains us that governance of the city becomes not that much management, but entrepreneurialism. When the same actors, the same state actors which were managing the city, now they have to be entrepreneurs. Now they have to look for the funds themselves. And in his vision, it's all connected to the shift from social welfare state to the neoliberal agenda. So on urban level, it performs in this way of changing the approaches of driving the urban development. There is actually a similar okay, let's stop here. I will look at the chat. Yeah, like we were talking about how this corruption is organized, and often it's legalized in form of charity. So I mean, when I was a kid, like my mom gave birth to my brother in 2003. At that time, you were just like paying cash to the doctors. I mean, that's the medical experience I remember. Like you had to like bribe. I mean, my mom was trying not to do that. That's why everyone, yeah, at that time, you actually could, as it was like, as corruption was like super informal, you could like make a poker face and not pay. So my mom, like my parents are super religious, and they consider bribery is a sin. And I remember that like my other relatives were bribing the doctors because my mom did not want to bribe the doctors. And yeah, it was like when corruption was super informal, you could actually like make a poker face and not pay and say like, you know, it's my constitutional right. I'm here. Corruption is a sin. I'm not going to do it. But now it's being legalized through these very strange things as like charitable, like charity contribution. And it's still sort of, you're not obliged to do it, but if you are not doing it, you're gonna and I mean, imagine you're like dying or you're pregnant and you're giving birth, and everyone around is angry at you because you did not bribe them. I don't think it's the best experience you want to have. Yes, so there is like very different treatment to those who gave charity and did not give charity. But yeah, coming back to managerialism. Yes, so managerialism is an approach which exists to, I mean, is an approach to urban development which existed in social welfare state. And Harvey says social welfare state and this whole, as he puts it, Fordist Keynesian regime. Do we have time on this? Yeah, let's talk about Ford and Keynes. Do you remember who is Henry Ford? Henry Ford. Okay, good. So, Henry Ford, I mean, he took. Sorry, there is this very nice phrase in English which can explain what I mean, but I forgot it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. People believe that Henry Ford invented mass production. I mean, with this. I also Okay, you will have time. If you don't know what did he invent, please Google it. I forgot the words in English. Just watch Charlie Chaplin. You will see how Fordism works. It's a type of production where you can very quickly produce a lot of similar things. Um, Charlie Chaplin movies are basically satire about this kind of organizing the economy. But with Fordist approaches to organizing the economy, the whole system changed to economy being organized about factories producing very similar things. But in these conditions, it's very easy to actually organize a state economy as a whole. It was happening not only in Soviet Union. Factories were being with this line. I think it's called line production. So when there is a line and people stay near this line and do very similar moves to produce like a detail or produce whatever, a cup, like everything. So mass production of goods, not like when you have cars. First of all, we're talking about cars because it's Henry Ford, the car Ford. And in when economy was organized in this Fordist way, as Harvey and many others think, it became possible to organize economy on the state level and strengthen the national states and create a system where every nation state is good in something. It's maybe very German oriented understanding of the Fordism, because of course they became the best in cars, good for them. But with this Fordist approach, you need to finish the production of the good in one place, on one factory. In these conditions, economy is organized on the nation-state level. It sounds something like that I'm telling something very obvious, but when the type of production changed from Fordism to outsourcing making of this small detail somewhere in China, economy from being organized on the nation-state level became a global economy. And this shift from neoliberalism is also part of this history of globalization and changing from the Fordist organization to global. And as Harvey tells us, only in these conditions of economy being organized on the level of nation state, it was possible to have social welfare state, which is also called a Keynesian regime, for example, because Keynes is an economist who developed this idea of redistribution. He combined like liberal understanding and Marxism, and he said that both are stupid. We need to combine them. We need to redistribute in the capitalist system. And in political terms, in ideological terms, it's called social democracy, like or democracy. Sorry, democracy. So this political ideology which advocates for redistribution, but still it's not like radical left which says capitalism is bad, we need to change the system. Social democrats are like moderate left, like liberal left. For example, Labour Party in the UK, but still majority of it, apart from Jeremy Corbyn, are quite liberal. But okay, we're not going to talk about politics now. So this process Harvey tries to describe has many words. Harvey talks about the change from for this Keynesian regime, so the same as social welfare state, the same as social democratic regime, to what he calls a flexible accumulation. And by this flexible accumulation, please remember, like, this is an important term today for you, flexible accumulation. But this flexible accumulation, he means this change of economy from the national level to global, and he means the neoliberal agenda. So on one hand, economic change, on the other hand, political change. Also, of course, ideological. But Harvey did not write that much about ideology. For example, Foucault did, and he developed this interesting. Oh my God, I'm talking about Foucault. But okay, let's talk about Foucault. It's interesting. Foucault developed this interesting idea of a neoliberal subject, by which he means that under this, in words of Harvey, flexible accumulation, this global economy where you need to or always be super entrepreneurial in order to become successful, every subject sort of takes all the risks of the system on him or herself. What I mean by this is that if the doctor, I mean, okay, as we're talking about doctors, let's talk about doctors. If the doctor is not good enough and did not manage to make people pay him bribes, he's not going to survive in this flexible accumulation. The same, and how does it, okay, I'm going to start talking about cities. How does the fuck, maybe you're asking yourself, apply to cities? In terms of that every city becomes this subject in this global market, and it constantly needs to be entrepreneurial and attract investment both from the nation state and from the global economy. Yeah. Oh, I had this amazing slide where everything is so structured. So how does this entrepreneurialism work? First of all, we're talking about public-private partnerships, PPP, which are sort of, it's a mechanism when the city hall, for example, it does not have enough funding to build a tram, or I don't know, to build some public infrastructure, and he says that, okay, the mayor goes to some private company and says, please give us money to develop the, I don't know, tram line, to develop some kind of urban renovation, and instead you will be allowed to build here your shopping mall. Like, for example, if we're talking about, I mean, actually, I don't know if something like this. I'm really not. I did not check it out. If some kind of public-private partnerships were there when the financing of the redevelopment of the Dvertseva Ploshcha, the railway station area, was organized, but very probably that partially the funding was coming from some private actors. And if you ask money, if you ask a private company to give you money, you need to give something instead. In urban conditions, often we're talking about land. Approach to urban development is when public sector assumes. So it's not as it's a citation, but I would say that it absorbs the risks, and the private sector takes the benefits. For example, if City Hall and some private company decided to start, for example, IT cluster. Like IT cluster in Lviv is like a classic example of entrepreneurial um, development. So both the city hall and the private companies are involved in development of this. Yeah, I will just quickly Google it for Chloe. I think you have to see this. I mean, maybe also uh, other people did not see this amazing, oh my God, development they're gonna build in Lviv. Yeah, check out their website. They're like so cool that you guys are never gonna be so cool. Like you cannot be cooler than IT cluster in Lviv. They're just like, oh yeah. Yeah, and actually it's Ukrainian Catholic University is also part of this project. So it's not only like public private partnership, it's like public church private partnership. Everyone is there. So and imagine IT cluster, I mean IT cluster, most probably it will be built, but imagine IT cluster like the public sector invested, the private sector invested, and then the IT, and then the IT bubble of this whole outsourcing IT to Ukraine bursts for some reasons. I don't know, Jeff Bezos, I mean, not Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, or one of those guys who are sitting in the Silicon Valley. They're like, oh, okay, we do not want to outsource to Ukraine because in India it's cheaper, or not in India, elsewhere. I'm speculating now. I don't know for sure what's going to happen to the IT sector. And this whole idea of building an IT cluster in Lviv goes down. But very probably, private sector will be like, okay, fine, but the money which were invested from the public sector, they're not gonna come back. They will just, I don't know, stay in form of unfinished developments. So you understood the logic. That's two sides are investing. For the private sector, we're talking about profits, or in case of unfortunate investment, we're talking about returning the funds. But it very much depends on how this partnership is organized, because some city halls can be quite sophisticated in addressing, involving in their projects private actors. But often, as the private actors are those who are main investors, they write down the conditions of the partnership. And usually legally, they defend themselves from the situation of losing and of unsuccessful project. But it really depends, and that's where actors come in, because we cannot just read an article about that public-private partnership is bad and blah blah blah, and then come to Lviv and say like our mayor is bad because he's doing public-private partnership. We need to actually take a look at those public-private partnership which exist in Lviv. First of all, we need to look at the actors. Who are the actors? For example, in IT cluster, you have some global actors, some investor from Canada. You also have like local landowners. So to understand how this partnership works, you need to first write down all the actors which are involved. Then you need to understand their interest. Why are they doing this? Why City Hall is doing this? Why private actor is investing? And to understand this combination of like this power game in this social network of these different actors will give us the answers about what is going on in the city. Because yes, there is this mechanism of PPP. Usually it's good for private sector, bad for public. But we still need to, look at the evidence which we have, for example, in Lviv. That could be a good idea for an individual essay for this course. And the third mechanism of this entrepreneurial approach to the city is that the development, as it's not managerialism, which tries to manage the whole city, but it's a project-oriented urban development, this kind of approach brings us to that only some parts of the urban space are being developed. And actually, that's what we can see really well in Ukrainian cities when public actors somehow get their public-private partnerships with the city hall for some piece of land and develop only this piece of land. And of course, they like to gate it and make this part of the city look amazing. But then you can look only like this. If you do this, you're gonna be already in a different reality. And of course, like Harvey talks mostly about cities which with very strong levels of segregation, where you have like poor area, like middle class areas, working class areas. If we're talking about American cities, we're also talking about racial segregation. In our case, this segregation and this development only of like some parts comes in this small islands of like, here we have a nice area, here we have a nice area. Like you can just like take a look at our campus. Like you walk through campus, everything looks just amazing, and then you just like, boo, where I am, oh my god, help me. Like when for example, for me, like I cycle through campus and then I need to enter the Strysky Park, and this entrance to Strysky Park is like a disaster because there is no proper pavement. You have holes which are like 10 centimeters deep, and it's always such a shock for me when you like cycle and you feel yourself that you were I don't know, somewhere in Vienna when you're at UKU campus, and then you enter Strysky Park and you're like in a, I don't know what, in a program Сдохни или умри, for those who watches it. Okay, so 3 mechanisms of entrepreneurial approach. Then Harvey also writes us about urban competition. You can read about this in the article. I'm not going to take your time. And as we started around, we have half an hour left. So is it more or less clear what is this entrepreneurialism and managerialism? You will, like, for the seminar, you will need to give me examples from your cities. So please ask me now if some things are not clear. Okay, good for you. It's either you are somewhere there not listening to the lecture, or I'm really good in explaining Harvey. So we're gonna jump to another theory which talks about similar issues of like actors, coalitions, and other stuff, by Harvey Molotch, who is still alive. And he's like, sorry, I need to open the door for my cat. Yeah, because she misses me when I work and close the door. So the core, the main question for Moloch, who was writing more or less at the same time when that David Harvey, but in a completely different university, and they were not friends at that time. Later, they got to know each other. He was writing about land issues. For him, like, he did not think that much about urban development. He was just looking at land as an object of analysis. And his main question was like, what role does land play in urban development? And why some land is urban, why some land is rural, how does it happen? And he starts with develop an answer to this question. He starts with a quite simple idea that land is a market commodity providing wealth and power, and as a consequence of it, that some very important people, as he puts it, consequently take a keen interest in it. It's a reference to his article from 1976. So he was already living in the aftermath of this, and he was also more writing about the US. I mean, he actually, in this article of 76, he highlights that his analysis concerns American cities. And he is warning us to redistribute these ideas on some other cities. So in the US at that time, land was way more commercialized than in Western Europe, and of course than in the USSR. But why I'm giving you this article? You might ask, why are we reading these old articles about how it was in the US in 70s? Because it's very interesting how his approach could be quite easily applied to post-Soviet countries, and you will see now how. So he says that land is a point of interest for many actors because it provides profit, wealth, and power. Of course, he rather talks about urban land, which has a different level of how much wealth and power it can provide you, depending on how close this part of land to something which people perceive as center of what they need. And it's also interesting that for different people, this value of land might be very different in the same city. But, I mean, in the way we perceive it, some people might value the central business district, some people, from the point of view of use value, not exchange value, if you remember what are those words. So though we might perceive though we might perceive that I don't know, Sikhiv is the best part of Lviv, the people who are actually profiting on Lviv land, they might have a completely different opinion about this, and the price of the land will be rather attached to their opinion than ours. That's why he also, because of this clash of ideologies about what is land value, Moloch puts here not only wealth but power, because it's also power to decide which part of the city is more profitable and which not, which is completely detached from the use value common citizens attach to these or other places. And Moloch explains us that there is a range of those important people who take a keen interest in the land, and he calls them, and he calls those um, important people, urban actors. And he says that these actors organize themselves in coalitions, or he also calls them, like he says, urban coalitions. Or, as he writes in this article, urban machines. I don't know. Now, it sounds like urban machine sounds quite weird, but it's a term which means this combination of actors who take the interest in the land. Who are actually those actors who built this urban machine which makes the city grow? It's a question to you. Who are these actors and what kind of interest do they might have? Oh, we talked about it already a bit in other classes. If you don't want to type, you can turn on your mic and talk. Okay, city government, landlords, good. Which other actors from the private sector? Because landlords are those who own some real estate and rent it. But there are other institutions. Businesses, yeah, like different services, and the developers themselves. Developer is забудовник. It's, I mean, developer at the same time might be a landlord because they're like developers who build something and then rent it. Developer is also, of course, a business, but it's, if we're talking about urban development, then developers are like crucial actors for these processes. But also, these are, let's say, like typical actor, like these are like key actors because city government takes control of the land, developers develop it. Then when there is something built, some like housing or offices, then we attract to this place other businesses like restaurants, etc., like shops, shopping malls, blah, blah, blah. But also, Moloch highlight that we're not talking about these two core um, actors, like sides of these processes. He also adds to the coalition, for example, educational institutions, universities. He says that for universities, it's important that the city develops because they constantly need, I mean, and we're talking about American universities, they constantly need the businesses to invest in them because universities in the US are themselves like a commercial institutions, and they always need investors from the private sector. They of course also need students. So in what Moloch describes to us, there's also these educational institutions which often take part in these coalitions. He also adds media to this coalition. Of course, media plays a specific role in this coalition. He explains how media constantly tries to create and recreate this idea of of this city being successful, growing, well performing, because if media exists on, not unlike in Ukraine, media is funded by big tycoons. If we're talking about US, especially in 70s, media private companies which, for example, if it's an urban media, their main funding comes from people who read them in the city. So obviously they're interested to be an urban media of a big city than of a small city. And from the context to the context, this range of actors might really differ. We can imagine that there might be some urban development where there is only one main actor, which is the city government, urban government. It might be the case that the government both formally legalizes the development, funds it, but it's like, as I told before, it's important to understand which actors are involved in certain project, but it's also important to understand why are they there, why are they interested in it, what are they expecting to get from this project. And if we're talking, and actually what Molich describes to us, it's we can easily apply it to the IT, the already mentioned IT cluster. So we have city hall, we have private investors of very different range, because there are some global investors, there are a lot of local investors, and like the IT companies that are investing in development of this cluster. There is a university which is highly interested in access to this cluster for the students. And of course, if you like Google IT cluster, I know Vitalik did this because we're working on the on research project about this IT cluster. If you Google about IT cluster, there are like a lot of very positive articles about that this IT cluster is going to change everything and it's going to be so perfect for our city and blah blah blah. Maybe, we don't know, it's still on the project, like on the level of project. What another actor Moloch does not mention, but in case of Ukraine, it's a very, I mean, not only of Ukraine, it's somehow like this actor was, I think, overlooked in many cases, probably because US does not depend that much on the railway connections. But in any European city, any big urban development involves transport institutions. If we're talking IT cluster, as we're all already talking about it, Ukrzaliznytsia, so Ukrainian railway, is an important institution there, because there was one plan where to build a railway stop. Now, as you know, there is going to be a railway stop in the IT cluster, which cuts other parts of the city from the railway connection, because of course only IT people need to be connected through railway to airport and railway station. People like us, no. I mean, maybe if you go and work in IT, you will have access to transport. I'm joking, but it's Moloch does not really mention it, but in Ukraine, in Western Europe, transport institutions and the way they build the infrastructure is a crucial factor for development that or the other project. We will talk about this more on the seminar, but to sum up this whole, I mean, I have also some slides about how urban coalition was developed in Kiev. Let's do like this. Let's finish, this theoretical part of the lecture. And then for those who have time to stay, I will discuss the Ukrainian context. But just to sum up, these two theories, they highlight us the importance of analysis of the local actors in the whole process of development. What is important to keep in mind that these articles were written in 70s. And at that time, involvement of global actors in urban development was not that strong. Now you cannot really imagine any big project without some investor from Canada or Germany or elsewhere. Also, role of financial institutions was not that was quite undermined compared to what we have now. So please read one of the articles. I would say that reading Harvey is a bit more complicated than reading Moloch, but yeah, just read one of them. It's going to be enough, and try not to, because like in Moloch in his article gives us a list of the actors, but don't try to like write down that list and like remember it. Try to understand the logic of how these actors are interested in the land, and then try to think what kind of actors do we have, because depending on the context, these actors might be like very different. But the logic that there are some actors which create a coalition, partnerships, in order to drive the city is something crucial. And what I want you to do is to having this idea in mind that there are different actors, they come together and they develop the city, each of them having their own interests. Sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's a political interest. Basically, city government, as we mentioned, it does not profit from these public-private partnerships in terms of money, but it profits in terms of political support. We can see it now on the streets of Lviv that Mayor Sadovy, the main idea in his political advertisement is that, look what I did. Look, he's longer than 5 years. Or, yeah, like he shows the results of his work. For him, it's political capital. He personally also profited, but in Ukraine, the same actor might be public and private at the same time. So despite of the fact that Sadovy profited on many of urban developments in Lviv, he also tries to earn political capital. And if we're talking about spaces where mayors are not businessmen at the same time, for city government, this development of the city might return in terms of votes or general political support, and so on. So we do not need to like write a list of actors and learn them and then use in every situation. We need to think of why some institutions, and yeah, we're talking about institutions, we're not, or at least organizations, why do they come together? How do they negotiate between themselves? Because also those actors, what is interesting, what I forgot to highlight, that these actors might be in a very strong conflict between themselves in other spheres. For example, different landlords. On one hand, like in some project, they are competing against each other. But when there is a profitable project for both of them, they might become part of the same coalition. So it's not only about institutions which are eager to do that. Sometimes they're not forced, but they have to do it because they lose profit. So they start working together in this coalition. And your main goal is to apply this logic to the cases you have. This kind of logic could be applied to very small cases of how, private business together with an NGO develops a park, or to very huge urban transformations. But please, in your papers, which you will write for the, like your short papers, your answers to the seminar, please give me examples. And do not don't be scared to Google a bit more about some project and look what media writes about it. Take a look who are main investors, Google who owns those investors, and so on. Yeah. Another thing which I forgot to say about post-Soviet context is that if we try to imagine this coalition as a social network, for example, like this one, it's a urban growth coalition which was functioning in Kiev during financialization period, so in 2000s. On one hand, so you can see that they're like domestic actors, international, public, and private. I divided them like in 4 groups. And among these, like we can also zoom in those social networks and take a look, like, okay, for example, this is Kiev Miskbud. It's the biggest developer, and at that time, and now after Ukrbud is being bankrupted, it's the biggest developer in Kiev and in Ukraine. We can always try to like zoom in that developer and understand who owns parts of this big company. The same applies to, you know, banks and other developers. But parts of this coalition, parts of these networks might be family networks, which is also very important aspect of how urban growth machines function in Ukraine. The best example is Hereha's family. Yesterday I was in Khmelnytsky and I saw this graffiti which was saying Hereho Zalezhny. It was really funny because, as you know, this family is from Khmelnytsky region, but now they work in the whole Ukraine, and as you might know, they own the epicenter chain, and at the same time the wife works for the government, so it's like a super family mafia from Khmelnytsky, which is a very good example of like post-Soviet urban growth coalition, because when Hereha, who is the wife, she signs some document that the city of Kiev needs to buy, I don't know, 100 liters of blue paint to paint, I don't know, everything in Kiev. She has the power to say that we need exactly this type of paint, which her husband sells. So, super entrepreneurial approach to urban development, which functions through a coalition, which is a family at the same time. But of course, these coalitions, I mean, it's an example of like very small coalition with very tight connection. But of course, these coalitions might perform in a more sophisticated way and not have this very strong ties. And as you all already noticed from my illustrations, one of the ways to analyze the urban growth coalitions is social network analysis. If you know, I mean, I'm not. If some of you work with SNA, you can try to work like to maybe in your individual essay try to analyze some coalition, because this was like these networks I built. I mean, on slides I have them like very general, but it's also a database of different actors and their connections, which I analyzed through. I use Stata, but there are a lot of tools how to do SNA. yeah, if you don't know what is SNA and you're interested, I can explain more how, because I worked with these tools a bit. I mean, not a bit. It's the only quantitative tool I am actually good with. Um, okay, what are we gonna do? I think we need to finish the lecture. We do not have time to discuss case of Kiev, but we will do it. During the seminars. Here are the. Sorry, I'm gonna look at the. Here are the questions for the seminar. Please choose one question and give me an example of from your city, from the city you know, because we are starting quite a practical part of our course where we're not only gonna speculate about whatever, but also let's try to start. Let's try. Let's try to start working with data. Yeah. Please, if you have any questions, let me know, and I'm just gonna put the deadline. Okay, as most of you are sending works in advance, I can put it on Thursday morning and read some of them in the evening and some of them in the morning. We start at, yeah, let's make it 10:30, 8:30. Okay, it's the deadline. But please send them in advance. And the earlier you send your answer, the more time I have to read it carefully and write you a comment, like a proper comment. I mean, but by the way, if I'm not answering for, like, sometimes I comment and say to you that this is good, this is bad. Sometimes I do not comment because your answers are just perfect. Sometimes I do not comment because I do not have time. But do not pay attention to this. It